fall of the Manchu dynasty. But there we go. Now, again, it's an interesting exercise to, although I think in most people's imagination, the simple reading of this is as a positive, literal understanding of the greatness of the Great Wall. However, I think a more careful reading suggests that although it's embedded in the Chinese national anthem today, the way in which it was originally conceived as being a part of that national anthem is more aligned with Lu Xun's remarks on in his prose poem on the previous slide. Rise up, those who would not be slaves, build our new Great Wall, right? Not the old one of bricks and stones, but again, that imaginary Great Wall, that ideological defense of national identity from our blood and flesh. But nevertheless, there's the first publication in which the music and the words appeared, showing Chinese volunteer troops campaigning in the region of the Great Wall. The Great Wall you can probably just make out in that rather grainy slide stretching across the landscape there. So there's a literal depiction of it there, but the words themselves are of about a concern on an imaginary Great Wall, a Great Wall of the mind, a new Great Wall built of sacrifice again. Interestingly enough, and this is really an aside, but the late 1970s, as you know, was the 60s and the late 60s and the early 70s are a very traumatic period for China, one of many traumatic periods, but one in which there was great instability in how national icons and ideological thinking was sustained. Great changes were taken. It was very difficult to maintain any stable understanding of what it meant to be the new Chinese nation that had been founded after the Communist Revolution in 1949. And so the words were changed. Build our new Great Wall from our blood and flesh is the old version. And for a brief time, interestingly enough, in the late 70s and early 80s, the Great Wall was removed altogether from the national anthem. Perhaps again because of the negative implications of the original song, but also the dissatisfaction with the Great Wall as a symbol of China. Instead, the line for that brief period of time read, "May the great Communist Party lead us to continue the long march." The reason for that substitution is, I don't know what debates would have been had about changing those lines, but it's also a play on words. The two words, Great Wall, or as we know, long wall, and long march, are very, very close in pronunciation, Changchang and Changjeng. So for that reason, I suppose it was a fairly natural substitution to make, to refer to this iconic moment in Communist Party history when the army moved from the south of China right up through the north in this very grueling expedition known as the Long March. But the current version of the national anthem has reverted to its original statement, in which the Great Wall can, with some effort, be understood as that monumental construction, that wonder of the world that you have photo opportunities in the suburbs north of Beijing. I need to show a few, in any talk, items from our own collection. We don't have anything intimately connected with the Great Wall, but we do have all sorts of items that can be brought in to tell the story. These items, I don't know whether you recognize what they are, but these are ones that a student in our department has been working on recently, and there's an article appearing in Expedition imminently introducing these. They've been in the collection a very, very long time, but they were neglected. Nobody paid much attention to them, so it's good that they've been getting some attention. They were produced in the first millennium BC by one of these populations, one of these pastoral nomadic populations north of what was prior to there being any Great Wall up there in that region. And as you can see, they both focus on domesticated animals. The very, very beautiful depiction of horses on the top example. Both of these, by the way, are very, very tiny. They're small bronze plaques. And these were the distinctive items of material culture that were associated with nomadic pastoralist groups north of the Great Wall area, against whom, when it was built under the first construction under the Qin, and subsequently, it was intended to inhibit. The reason for this, so why are walls a permanent feature of the North Chinese relationship with its neighbors? For ecological reasons. the line of the Great Wall consistently, and this is the point I'm trying to make, is that although the physical structure that we see north of Beijing today, built by the Ming Dynasty, is not the physical structure that the Qin built 2,000 years earlier, nevertheless, the model for interaction, the model for defensive constructions was exactly the same one, applied repeatedly within that span of time. Here we've got a map of precipitation in China. And as you can see, let me see if I've got do I have a pointer on this? Does anybody at the back know that I've got a pointer or not? Oh, there we go. I can point. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I can point down here. We're going to be looking repeatedly at this region here, the Great Bend in the Yellow River, where it rises out of the periphery of the Tibetan Plateau, shoots up north, bends over across eastwards, and then comes back down again before traversing the North China Plain to reach the sea. And as you can see, there's a gradient, a north to south gradient from South China that extends right through that region and beyond, becoming increasingly desiccated over time. So within south of where that Great Bend in the Yellow River lies, are areas where intensive rain-fed agriculture is possible, helped also by irrigation, of course. To the north of that region, rain-fed agriculture without the help of irrigation has been very, very difficult. And that produces that ecological cline, that ecological gradient produces also a social and political gradient. Within the southern end of that spectrum, dense populations fed by that rain-fed agriculture are able to concentrate in permanent cities intimately tied to their agricultural production. Whereas in the northern area, although there's occasional resort to agriculture, it's much more, the region is not capable of sustaining those dense populations. So the population is much more dispersed and crucially much more mobile. And it's the mobility that explains why this barrier was repeatedly thought to be necessary. Horse mount, we saw on the previous slide with the bronze plaques, the horse is incredibly important for those populations in the north. They were able to produce and train and breed horses to a much higher standard than they were in the south. And the mobility and that lack of a tie to large, dense settlements made them a persistent threat to the more southerly Chinese populations. So, and that hasn't changed. That's the underlying Kircher in that sense, although he wasn't thinking in ecological terms. He was right in that sense of there being a constant model for the contrast between these regions that persists until the horse ceases to be the quickest way of moving around, the quickest way of getting between two places, displaced, of course, by motorized transport, the telegraph, and modern weaponry. Okay, there's a close-up of, we'll see some more pictures of this same region, but the Great Bend in the Yellow River, where it reaches north and goes thrusts deep into the steppe region, into the pastoral nomad area, and then comes back south again. So controlling that area is what the Qin were trying to do. It's what the Ming Dynasty were trying to do, and not just those two terminal points of our history, but all the way through. Control over that region, for the reasons I just mentioned, is why there was continual resort to the building of walls. There we go. There's the region the same region in a satellite map. Again, the cover by vegetation is very, very visible in this particular image here. And although we don't, I need to go back one. Although we don't see the river, the Yellow River, very clearly depicted there, we can nevertheless see that line of green, right? There's that reaches up north. Everybody can see that, I hope, reasonably clearly. There's that large rectangle of grayish yellow, which is the relatively desiccated area within the Ordos Bend, the bend in the Yellow River, but with a line of green along the banks along the sides of the river where irrigation is possible and makes farming intensive. So control over that region is what most of the wall building is all about. Our first textual the first time we see that word, changchang, extended bulwarks or long walls, is during the Eastern Zhou period. So prior to the Qin king mentioned by Athanasius Kircher, by a few centuries, during a time when the Chinese heartland is divided by multiple competing Chinese-speaking and culturally allied states. And the earliest mentions of this Great Wall are talking about of great walls, are walls between these states, not against the northern nomadic invader, but rather dividing up their territory between them. So they're fulfilling the model of intensive agricultural-based, dense populations being administered by this state in a very, with a literate bureaucracy. So it's very tight control by governments over their territorial regions and over the populations as well. Governments, the political powers of this time are able to mobilize their populations in a very intense way. They're able to tax them very intensely, they're able to finance large projects, and they're able to mobilize manpower. And that's what makes building the walls possible. So the early walls, there's one, for example, that you can see between Qi and Chu. Again, I'm not going to, let me see if I can, there we go. No, I'm having trouble, but you can see Qi spelled Qi and Chu, Chu. Those two of those warring states have a wall indicated between them on this particular map. And it was walls like that between these neighboring states that are the first textual uses of that word that we had on the slide right at the beginning. But towards the end of that period, the state of Qin, who's the pink one, Qin in the far west, dominates all the others, and in a sort of cascade of domino toppling, the Qin state vanquishes all its competitors further east. And that's the period that Athanasius Kircher is focusing on. The king of Qin is the final king of Qin who, having displaced all his competition, unifies the Chinese-speaking world and then builds walls against his pastoral nomad competitors to the north. Let's have a look at, it's a very short account. All of the documents from this early period are scattered and brief, but nevertheless they give it some insight as to what the motivations were for these early constructions. This passage on the screen here is taken from the records of the historian by Sima Qian, who was a late 2nd century BC Han Dynasty author. So he's writing about events 100 years prior to his time. And this is the passage that indirectly Athanasius Kircher was referring to when he described that misspelled king of Qin, Xio. He's referring to this very passage of text, which he wouldn't have read himself, but which had been digested for him and transmitted to Europe. So in the 26th year of the first emperor, that's 221 BC, the year of the unification, the year when he stops being just simply the king of Qin, but becomes the first emperor of a unified China. Meng Tian is the general with whom the construction of this project is associated. He inherits his status as Qin general, attacks Qi, and remember Qi from the previous screen. There we go. Qi was the last of the warring states to hold out against Qin. So that's the final domino to topple in this cascade of conquest. So the Qin general attacks Qi and vanquished it. Qin, having united all under heaven, Meng Tian was commanded to lead a force of 300,000, so a suspiciously round figure. He probably wasn't leading 300,000 in one single campaign to one single point in the north, but it's an impressionistic numerical sense of how dramatic this project was. And we're going to see, and it's not in terms of the number of people who were involved in wall building at various stages under this reign, it's not an overly ambitious figure. But it probably wasn't a single campaign being led by one single general. Anyway, Meng Tian was commanded to lead a force of 300,000 to pursue the tribes of the north and to take the region south of the river. South of the river meaning the south within that bend that we've had repeated, the so-called Ordos Loop, or the Great Bend in the Yellow River. And to take the region south of the river, he constructed a long wall. Okay, there's another instance of our Changchang, right, our extended bulwarks, our long walls, following the topography to form narrow passes, beginning at Lintao, and we'll see where that is in a second, and running to Liaodong. That's all the way from the very east of the Chinese-speaking world at that time to the very west, Lintao being in the west, Liaodong being in the east. Extending over 10,000 li. Now, a li is a Chinese mile, so it's about a third of a modern mile. And there we go. We see these figures cropping up all the time. You have to keep some mental track of how long we're talking about. But this is about 3,000, over 3,000 modern miles. The army was abroad for more than 10 years. So in this very compressed, that's it. That's all there is in this passage. A very, very brief description of the events during the immediately after the Qin unification. We see actually it's not a single campaign. It's a series of very, very dispersed wall construction projects that occur right the way around the boundary of the Chinese-speaking world. And in very intensive work by Chinese archaeologists